Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I've been a paramedic in rural Ohio for about 8 years now, and nothing really prepares you for what I experienced last Thursday night. I was pulling a double shift with my partner, Jake, because we were short-staffed again, typical for our small county station. Around 11 p.m., we got dispatched to a single vehicle accident on Highway 47, right by mile marker 23. That stretch of road is notorious for accidents because of the sharp curve that comes out of nowhere after a long straight section. We'd responded to plenty of crashes there before, but something about this particular night felt different from the moment we got the call. The dispatcher's voice had this strange hesitation when she gave us the victim's name, Catherine Brennan, 32 years old. I remember thinking it was odd how she repeated the name twice, real slow, like she was making sure we heard it right. When we arrived at the scene, the car was completely wrapped around a telephone pole, the front end crushed like an aluminum can. The driver's side was caved in so badly that I honestly didn't expect to find anyone alive in there. But there she was, Catherine Brennan, conscious and talking, asking about her purse of all things. She had this deep gash across her forehead that was bleeding pretty bad, and her left arm was clearly broken, bent at an angle that made Jake wince. But considering the state of that Toyota Camry, she should have been dead on impact. I've seen enough crashes to know when physics doesn't add up, and this was one of those times. While Jake worked on stabilizing her neck, I noticed she kept mumbling something about being late for dinner, about how her husband would be worried. Her eyes had this distant quality, like she was looking through me rather than at me. But her vitals were surprisingly stable. Blood pressure a little low, but nothing critical. Steady pulse, responsive pupils. We got her out of the wreck using the jaws of life. Took us about 20 minutes of careful cutting to extract her without causing more damage. The whole time, Catherine kept apologizing, saying she didn't mean to cause trouble, that she just needed to get home. There was something mechanical about the way she spoke, like she was reciting lines she'd memorized. Her skin felt oddly cool to the touch, even though it was a warm September night, and when I checked her pupils again with my pen light, they reacted normally but seemed to have this grayish tint around the edges. Jake mentioned later that he noticed it too, said it reminded him of cataracts, but Catherine was way too young for that. We loaded her into the ambulance and I rode in the back with her while Jake drove. During the 15-minute ride to County General, she asked me 3 times what day it was, and each time I told her it was Thursday, she'd nod slowly and say, "Thursday, right, Thursday." At the hospital, Dr. Nguyen took over immediately, whisking Catherine away for x-rays and a CT scan. Jake and I grabbed coffee in the break room, filling out our paperwork and talking about how lucky she'd been. The charge nurse, Donna, overheard us discussing the case and got this weird look on her face. She asked us to repeat the patient's name, and when we said Catherine Brennan, she literally dropped her clipboard. Donna's been working emergency for 20 years. Nothing rattles her, but she went pale as a sheet. She pulled us into an empty exam room and closed the door behind her. "That's not possible," she kept saying, shaking her head. Then she told us that Catherine Brennan had been brought in DOA 5 days ago, Monday night, from a single vehicle accident on Highway 47, same exact location, mile marker 23. She'd hit the same telephone pole. Donna even pulled up the records on her tablet to show us. Same name, same age, same address, even the same Toyota Camry. Silver, license plate ending in 347. Jake thought Donna was messing with us at first, but her face told a different story. She showed us the death certificate, the autopsy report. Catherine Brennan had died from massive internal bleeding and head trauma, pronounced dead at 11:47 p.m. that Monday. The attending physician's signature was right there in black ink. I felt this cold weight settle in my chest as I looked at that paperwork, then back at Donna. We'd just brought in a woman who'd been dead for 5 days, and she'd been talking to us, breathing on her own, bleeding real blood. Jake ran back to check with admitting, thinking maybe there'd been some kind of mix-up with the names or paperwork. But the woman we'd brought in had given the same social security number, the same date of birth, even had the same small tattoo on her right wrist, a little hummingbird that Catherine had mentioned her daughter drew for her. The worst part was when Jake pulled up our ambulance's dash cam footage on his phone to prove we weren't losing our minds, and there she was, clear as day, being loaded onto our stretcher. Dr. Nguyen found us about an hour later, looking confused and frustrated. He said Catherine, or whoever we'd brought in, had vanished from radiology. One moment she was on the table waiting for her CT scan. The tech had stepped out to adjust the settings, and when he came back, the room was empty. Security footage showed her walking down the hallway in her hospital gown, moving with this purposeful stride despite her injuries, heading straight for the exit. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. She didn't show up on half the cameras. The ones by the emergency entrance captured her clear as day, but the hallway cameras near radiology just showed an empty corridor with the automatic doors opening and closing by themselves. The security guard, Tom, said he saw her walk right past his desk, even nodded at her. But his partner sitting right next to him swears nobody walked by. They actually got into an argument about it, each one thinking the other was playing some kind of prank. By the time anyone thought to follow her, she was gone, and her hospital gown was found neatly folded in the parking lot, right next to where we'd brought her in. The next morning, around 6 a.m., we got another call. Same location, Highway 47, mile marker 23. My heart started racing when dispatch said the name, Catherine Brennan. Jake and I looked at each other, and without saying a word, we both knew we had to go. When we arrived, there was no accident, no car, nothing but empty road and that same telephone pole with fresh scars from impacts old and new. We sat there in the ambulance for a few minutes, engine running, just staring at that curve in the road. Then dispatch called again. They'd made a mistake, no accident had been reported. But I know what I heard, and Jake heard it too. We drove back to the station in silence, neither of us wanting to talk about what was happening. The shift supervisor, Captain Roberts, was waiting for us when we got back. He'd gotten a call from County General about the incident the night before, and wanted to know if we'd been drinking on duty. When we showed him our dashcam footage, his expression changed from skeptical to concerned. He made us take drug tests right then and there. Both came back clean, obviously. That afternoon, I couldn't sleep even though I was exhausted, so I did something I probably shouldn't have. I drove to the address listed in Catherine Brennan's file, a small ranch house on Sycamore Drive, about 10 miles from the accident site. A man answered the door, mid-30s, looking like he hadn't slept in days. When I introduced myself and mentioned Catherine's name, he just stared at me for the longest time. Then he invited me in, and what he told me made everything infinitely worse. His name was Brian Brennan, Catherine's husband. She died on Monday, just like the hospital records showed. But here's the thing. She'd been driving home from her sister's house in Columbus, a trip she made every Sunday night. She'd called him around 10:30 p.m. saying she was tired and going to pull over at the rest stop for a quick nap. The last thing she told him was that she'd be home soon, that she just needed to close her eyes for a minute. They found her car wrapped around that pole an hour later. But Brian said something that made my skin prickle. Since Monday, he'd been getting voicemails from Catherine's phone every night around 11:30 p.m. Just breathing, sometimes a whisper that sounded like almost home. Then the line would go dead. Her phone was supposedly destroyed in the crash. Brian showed me Catherine's obituary in the local paper, her funeral program from Wednesday, even photos from the service. There she was, same woman we'd pulled from that wreck, lying in a casket surrounded by white roses. He broke down crying, saying he thought he was going crazy, that grief was making him imagine things. I didn't tell him about what happened the night before. How could I? How do you tell someone that you pulled their dead wife from a car crash 3 days after her funeral? But then he grabbed my arm as I was leaving and said something that stopped me cold. He said Catherine had been having the same recurring nightmare for weeks before she died, always about getting into an accident at that exact spot on Highway 47, always trying to get home but never quite making it. She'd even started taking a different route to avoid that stretch of road. But that night, her usual route through downtown was closed for construction. She had no choice but to take Highway 47. Brian asked me if I believed in loops, in people getting stuck somehow. I didn't know what to say, so I just squeezed his shoulder and left. When I got back to the station that evening for my next shift, there were 3 more calls logged for that same location throughout the day, all reporting accidents involving Catherine Brennan. But when units arrived, nothing. The other crews were starting to talk, word spreading through the department about the woman who wouldn't stay dead. Jake had done his own digging and found something that made my stomach turn. Over the past 18 months, there had been 7 fatal accidents at that exact spot. All single vehicles, all late at night, all drivers who were traveling alone. But Catherine's name only started appearing after her death on Monday. The county commissioner had approved funds for better lighting and warning signs for that curve 6 months ago. But the work kept getting delayed. Contractor issues, supply problems, always something. Jake pulled up the work orders, and every single delay was logged on a Monday night, right around 11:30 p.m. The contractor's notes mentioned equipment mysteriously moving overnight, fresh tire marks appearing that didn't match any of their vehicles, and workers reporting they felt uncomfortable at the site, though nobody could explain exactly why. That night, Thursday again, we got the call at exactly 11 p.m. Same location, same name, but this time dispatch sounded different. Tired, mechanical, like they were reading from a script. Jake wanted to ignore it, said we should let another unit take it, but we both knew nobody else would go. When we arrived, the scene was exactly as it had been the night before. The silver Camry wrapped around the pole, the door caved in, everything identical down to the pattern of broken glass on the asphalt. But this time, when I approached the vehicle, Catherine was looking right at me through the shattered windshield. Not through me like before, but at me. And she said my name. She knew my name. She thanked me for trying to help her, said she was sorry for the trouble, but she needed to get home. Her husband was waiting. Her injuries were exactly the same. The gash on her forehead, the broken arm, everything precisely as it had been 24 hours earlier. We went through the entire routine again. Extraction, stabilization, transport. But this time, I noticed something different. The blood on her forehead wasn't flowing right. It would drip, then seem to reverse, like a video playing backward for just a second. Jake saw it too, went completely quiet, just focused on driving faster. At the hospital, I made a decision. Instead of taking her through the normal admission process, I stayed with her, never let her out of my sight. I held her hand while they wheeled her to radiology, stood right outside the door during the CT scan. She kept asking what day it was, and when I said Thursday, she'd get this confused look and whisper, "But I already lived through Thursday." Around midnight, she became agitated, said she needed to leave, that if she didn't go now, she'd miss her chance. I tried to calm her down, but she grabbed my hand with surprising strength and looked me dead in the eyes. "Every night," she said, "I take that curve, and every night I don't make it home. But maybe if someone remembers, maybe if someone knows I'm trying." Then she was gone. Not vanished like before. She just closed her eyes and flatlined. Dr. Nguyen called it at 12:03 a.m., and this time she stayed dead. The body remained cold and still, and when they checked her liver temperature, she'd been dead for days, just like the original autopsy showed. The calls stopped after that night. No more Catherine Brennan. No more phantom accidents at mile marker 23. The county finally installed those lights and warning signs the following week. The contractor said it was the smoothest job they'd ever done, like something that had been blocking them was suddenly gone. I went to see Brian one more time, told him Catherine had been trying to come home, that she wanted him to know that. He cried, but it seemed like a weight had lifted from his shoulders. He said the phone calls had stopped too, right at 12:03 a.m. that Friday morning. His phone had rung one last time, and when he answered, he heard Catherine's voice clear as day saying, "I made it." Then nothing but dial tone. He played me the voicemail. It was just static to my ears, but he swore he could hear her. Maybe he could. I've learned not to question what people experience in their grief. Jake and I never talked about it directly again, but we both put in requests to change our Thursday night shifts. Captain Roberts approved them without asking questions. I think he knew something had happened that didn't fit in any report. The official paperwork showed that we responded to one fatal accident on Monday night, Catherine Brennan, DOA. Everything else, the Thursday night calls, the second crash, her disappearing from the hospital, none of it exists in any official record. The other crews who logged those phantom calls during the week all amended their reports to equipment malfunction. Sometimes that's easier than trying to explain the unexplainable. I still drive past that spot sometimes, and they've had no accidents there since the lights went up. But every Thursday night around 11 p.m., I notice fresh tire marks on the shoulder right by that pole, like someone pulled over and stopped for a moment before continuing home. I like to think it's Catherine, finally making that turn, finally completing her journey, even if it's somewhere we can't see. I spent 12 years as a paramedic in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and thought I'd seen everything the job could throw at me. February of 2022 changed that perspective completely. I was working the night shift with my partner Gary, a 20-year veteran who'd trained me when I first started. We'd been partnered for about 6 years at that point, and between us we'd handled thousands of calls, overdoses, car accidents, heart attacks, you name it. Our station covered the east side of the city, mostly residential neighborhoods mixed with some industrial areas near the river. It was a Tuesday night, cold as hell with that kind of wind that cuts right through your uniform no matter how many layers you've got on. We'd just finished dinner at the station, some leftover chili Gary's wife had sent with him, when the first call came through around 11:47 p.m. The dispatch came in as a code 3, lights and sirens for a cardiac arrest at 1847 Willow Avenue. Gary grabbed the keys while I pulled up the address on our GPS, but something weird happened. The system couldn't find it. Not unusual in itself. Sometimes new developments don't update right away, or dispatch gets a number wrong. But then our CAD system, the computer that feeds us call information, displayed the address with a red flag next to it. That flag meant the address was marked as non-existent in city records. I mentioned it to Gary, but he just shrugged and said dispatch probably screwed up the street name. We headed toward Willow Avenue anyway, figuring we'd get clarification en route. The whole drive there, dispatch kept updating us with details. Elderly male, approximately 70 years old, wife performing CPR, patient last seen conscious 15 minutes ago. Standard stuff, except when we turned onto Willow Avenue, the numbers jumped from 1845 to 1851. There was no 1847. We parked between the two houses and got out, looking for any sign of distress. The lot where 1847 should have been was just an empty space, overgrown with dead winter grass and surrounded by a chain-link fence that had seen better days. No foundation, no driveway, nothing to indicate a house had been there recently. Gary radioed dispatch while I walked the perimeter with my flashlight. The neighboring houses were dark except for porch lights. No signs of anyone doing CPR or having a medical emergency. Dispatch insisted the call was valid. They had a woman on the line saying her husband Harold was turning blue, giving the address as 1847 Willow Avenue. They even played us a snippet of the audio through our radio. The woman's voice was strained, desperate, counting out compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. Please hurry, he's not responding. But we were standing in front of an empty lot, and the temperature readout on our ambulance showed 18 degrees. Nobody was outside, no house existed at that address. Gary knocked on the door at 1845, waking up a young couple with a baby. They said the lot next door had been empty since they'd moved in 3 years ago. The husband mentioned something about a fire way before their time, maybe 7 or 8 years back, but he didn't know details. We checked 1851 on the other side. An elderly woman answered, clearly confused why paramedics were at her door near midnight. She'd lived there since 1987 and told us the house at 1847 had burned down in January of 2015. Complete loss, she said. The family that lived there, the Bowers, Harold and Margaret Bauer, had both died in the fire. She remembered because she'd gone to both funerals, Even showed us the memorial cards she kept in her kitchen drawer. Harold Bauer, age 71. Margaret Bauer, age 68, died January 15, 2015. We thanked her and walked back to our rig, but dispatch was going crazy on the radio, saying the caller was screaming that her husband had stopped breathing. Gary and I sat in the ambulance for a minute, neither of us sure what to do. Dispatch patched the audio through to us directly, and I heard it clear as day. A woman sobbing, begging us to help Harold, saying we must have the wrong house. They were at 1847 Willow Avenue, the white colonial with green shutters. She described the house in detail, the wraparound porch, the 2 dogwood trees in the front yard, the black mailbox with painted cardinals on it. Gary pulled out his phone and searched for news articles about the fire. Found it pretty quick. The Cedar Rapids Gazette, January 16, 2015. Elderly couple perishes in overnight house fire. The article had a photo of the house from before the fire. White colonial, green shutters, 2 dogwood trees in front. The mailbox was hard to see in the picture, but when Gary zoomed in, you could just make out what looked like red birds painted on the side. Every detail the caller was giving dispatch matched a house that had been gone for 7 years. We drove back to the station in silence. Gary wrote up the report as unable to locate patient, and we figured that would be the end of it. Maybe someone was pranking dispatch with spoofed numbers or something. But the next night, Wednesday, at exactly 11:47 p.m., the same call came in. Different emergency this time, stroke symptoms, same address, 1847 Willow Avenue. Same caller, Margaret Bauer, saying Harold was slurring his words, his face drooping on the left side. This time we weren't the only unit that responded. Engine 19 showed up too, and their captain, Phil Kowalczyk, was just as confused as we were. He'd actually fought the fire back in 2015, remembered it clearly because it was one of the worst residential fires he'd worked. Said they'd found the couple in their bedroom, looked like they'd been overcome by smoke in their sleep. Now here we all were, standing in front of that same empty lot, while dispatch relayed Margaret's voice describing Harold's symptoms in medical detail that was disturbingly accurate. Facial asymmetry, left arm weakness, difficulty swallowing, onset approximately 20 minutes ago. Phil called his chief directly while we were still on scene. Within an hour, we had IT specialists at dispatch trying to trace the calls. The number coming through showed as disconnected when they tried calling it back, but when the calls came in, they registered as genuine 911 calls from a landline. The phone company confirmed that the number had belonged to the Bauer residence, but was discontinued after the fire in 2015. No one could explain how a deadline was generating active emergency calls. The IT guys stayed at dispatch all night, and sure enough, when we rolled around to the next night, same thing. 11:47 p.m., another call from 1847 Willow Avenue. This time it was difficulty breathing. Harold having an acute asthma attack, according to Margaret. She was using medical terminology, describing respiratory distress, asking if we had albuterol in the rig, saying his oxygen saturation was dropping based on the fingertip pulse oximeter they kept in their bedroom. The details were so specific, so accurate to real emergency protocols, that our medical director, Dr. Anita Freeman, got involved. Dr. Freeman was a no-nonsense trauma surgeon who'd been medical director for our EMS system for 15 years. She pulled all the recordings and had us write detailed statements about each response. Then she did something none of us expected. She had the IT department pull the original 911 recordings from January 15, 2015, the night of the fire. Those calls had been archived in the old system, but they managed to recover them. We all gathered in the conference room at the main station to listen. The first call at 11:47 p.m. was Margaret Bauer, reporting that Harold was having chest pains. The second call, about 15 minutes later, was her saying he'd collapsed, she was doing CPR. The third call never got through completely. You could hear coughing, Margaret's voice getting weaker, saying something about smoke, then nothing. The fire department got dispatched on a separate alarm from a neighbor who saw flames, but by then it was too late. Here's what made everyone in that room go quiet. The calls we were getting now in 2022 were almost word for word identical to the first two calls from that night in 2015, except they kept repeating, night after night, different medical emergencies but always starting at 11:47 p.m. The city administrator got involved after the local news caught wind of it. They brought in consultants, tech experts from the state, even had the FBI's cyber crimes unit take a look in case someone was hacking the 911 system. Nothing. The calls weren't coming from any traceable source. They seemed to originate from nowhere, appearing directly in the dispatch system with all the characteristics of a real emergency call, but no physical origin point. We kept responding every night because we had to. It was protocol. Even knowing no one would be there, even knowing Harold and Margaret Bauer had been dead for 7 years, we had to treat each call as genuine. Some nights it was chest pains, others it was diabetic emergencies, seizures, falls with hip fractures. The medical emergencies varied, but Margaret's voice was always the same. Frightened but trying to stay calm, using their home address, describing Harold's symptoms with the kind of detail that only someone living through it could provide. She'd mention the medications he was on, his medical history, allergies to penicillin and morphine, everything dispatch would need to know. By the end of the second week, it was taking a toll on everyone. Gary started calling in sick for night shifts. Other crews were refusing to respond to that address. The dispatcher, who usually worked nights, Janet, requested a transfer to days because she couldn't handle hearing Margaret's voice anymore, especially knowing what we all knew. Phil from Engine 19 dug deeper into the fire investigation records. The official cause was electrical, old wiring in the walls, probably sparked inside the bedroom wall while they slept. The smoke detectors had batteries, but they were expired, didn't go off in time. The fire spread through the walls and ceiling before breaking through. By then, the smoke had already filled their bedroom. The medical examiner's report showed they'd both died from smoke inhalation, probably never woke up. But here's the detail that got to me. Harold had been having chest pains earlier that evening, according to their neighbor. Margaret had wanted to call 911, but Harold insisted he was fine, just heartburn from dinner. They went to bed at their normal time, around 11:30 p.m. If she'd made that call when she wanted to, they would have been at the hospital when the fire started. The calls continued for exactly 30 days. Each night at 11:47 p.m., Margaret's voice would come through dispatch, reporting a different medical emergency for Harold. We documented every single one: cardiac events, strokes, diabetic comas, severe allergic reactions, breathing difficulties, seizures. 30 different emergency scenarios, all medically accurate, all described with the kind of intimate knowledge a wife of 43 years would have about her husband's health. The 30th night was different, though. It was a Monday in March, and I was actually off duty, but I drove to the empty lot anyway. I'd been doing that even on my nights off, just sitting in my car, watching. Gary was there too in his pickup truck, even though he'd officially transferred to day shift. Phil was there with 2 other firefighters. Janet, the dispatcher who'd transferred, she was there. We all just gathered without planning it, drawn to that empty lot. At 11:47 p.m., our radios crackled. We were all monitoring dispatch from our vehicles. But this time, the call was different. Margaret wasn't reporting a medical emergency. She was calling about smoke in the house. Harold wasn't responding. She couldn't see, couldn't breathe. It was the 3rd call from 2015, the one that had cut off. We heard her coughing, gasping, then her voice, weak but clear. We should have gone to the hospital. Tell them we should have gone. Then nothing. Dead air. After that night, the calls stopped completely. The IT department monitored the system 24/7 for weeks, but nothing came through from that address again. The city eventually had the lot cleaned up, put a small memorial plaque there for the Bauers. I still work as a paramedic, but I moved to day shift permanently. Can't do nights anymore. Gary took early retirement last year. We don't talk about it much, but when we do grab a beer occasionally, we both admit the same thing. We still check our phones at 11:47 p.m. sometimes, expecting to hear dispatch tones. The official investigation concluded with no explanation. just noted as a technical anomaly in the system. But those of us who heard Margaret's voice night after night, who responded to that empty lot, we know it wasn't just a glitch. I don't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, never have. But I do believe that sometimes, somehow, echoes of things that should have happened can bleed through. Margaret wanted to call 911 that night for Harold's chest pains. She wanted to, but didn't. Maybe for 30 nights in 2022, she finally got to make those calls she'd wanted to make. That's the only explanation I can live with. I need someone to tell me I'm not losing my mind. For the past 6 months, I've been a paramedic in Denver, and something's been happening during my shifts that nobody wants to talk about. I'm 32, been in emergency medicine for 8 years now, started as an EMT in California, before moving here for a fresh start after my divorce. The job's always been tough. You see people on their worst days, sometimes their last days. But I've handled it well, never had issues with the stress or the long hours. My supervisor, a gruff guy named Douglas with 20 years under his belt, even said I had the steadiest nerves he'd seen in a rookie at this station. But lately, I've been questioning everything I thought I knew about death, about when someone's really gone, and why these things only happen when I'm the one responding. The first time was in early March, around 3 in the morning. We got called to an apartment complex on the west side. Elderly man named Arthur Simmons, 78 years old, cardiac arrest. His neighbor heard him collapse through the thin walls and called 911. When my partner Vanessa and I arrived, Arthur had been down for at least 15 minutes according to dispatch. No pulse, no breathing, pupils fixed and dilated, textbook signs of death. We worked on him for 30 minutes, pushed 3 rounds of epi, nothing. The ER doctor, a young resident named Dr. Patel who always looked exhausted, called it at 3:47 a.m. Standard procedure, we started cleaning up our equipment while the nurses prepared the body for the morgue. But as I was packing the defibrillator, I saw Arthur's chest rise. Not a gasp or a sudden movement, just a slow, deliberate breath like someone sleeping peacefully. I grabbed Dr. Patel's arm so hard she almost dropped her tablet pointed at Arthur, but by then his chest was still again. Dr. Patel checked him again, pressed her stethoscope against his chest for a full minute while I held my breath. Nothing. She gave me that look. You know, the one medical professionals give each other when someone's been working too many doubles. Agonal breathing, she said, though Arthur had been declared dead for 5 minutes already. Sometimes the body does things after death. Muscle memory, residual electrical activity. It happens. Vanessa hadn't seen anything. She'd been facing away, filling out paperwork. I wanted to argue, to insist she run another EKG, but Arthur was already being wheeled away, and we had another call coming in. For the next week, I kept thinking about that single breath, wondering if I'd imagined it. I even pulled Arthur's file later. Confirmed dead on arrival at the morgue. No unusual findings. But that wasn't the last time. 2 weeks later, same thing. Different patient, a woman named Gloria Nash, 53, found unconscious in her bathroom after what looked like a massive stroke. We couldn't get her back. Worked on her for 40 minutes before calling it. This time I watched carefully. Didn't take my eyes off her after Dr. Reeves, different doctor, same exhausted look, pronounced her at 11:23 p.m. 17 minutes later, while we were still completing paperwork in the hallway, I saw it through the doorway. Gloria's fingers on her left hand curled slowly, deliberately, like she was trying to grasp something. Not a spasm or a twitch, but a controlled movement that lasted maybe 3 seconds. I called Vanessa over immediately, but when we got to the bedside, Gloria's hand was perfectly still, already showing the early signs of rigor mortis setting in. Vanessa thought I was seeing things, suggested I take a few days off, maybe get my eyes checked. I started keeping a journal, documenting every cardiac arrest, every patient we couldn't save. Most were normal, if you can call death normal. But then came patient number 3, April 2nd, a construction worker named Frank Russo who fell from scaffolding. Massive head trauma, never had a chance. We pronounced him on scene at 2:15 p.m., bright sunny day, witnesses everywhere. While we waited for the coroner, I stayed with the body, told everyone I was doing paperwork. For 23 minutes, nothing. Then Frank's chest began rising and falling in a rhythm, steady as clockwork, about 8 breaths per minute. I counted them, filmed it on my phone for 12 seconds before my supervisor called me away for another emergency. When I checked the video later that night in my apartment, all I had was footage of a still body. The timestamp was right, the angle was right, but Frank wasn't breathing in the video. I watched it 40 times, compared it to what I remembered seeing, and started wondering if I was having some kind of breakdown. The thing is, I felt completely fine otherwise. My performance reviews were excellent, I was sleeping well, eating normally, even started dating someone new. A teacher named Melissa who had nothing to do with medical work. But these incidents kept happening, and only during my shifts. I compared notes with other paramedics without directly asking. Nobody else mentioned anything unusual. I even switched partners for a week, worked with an old-timer named Carlos, who'd been doing this for 15 years. The very first cardiac arrest we responded to together, an elderly woman named Dorothy Huang, showed the same signs. After she was pronounced dead at 9:45 p.m., I watched her eyelids flutter rhythmically for 6 minutes straight, like REM sleep. Carlos was standing right next to me, checking his phone. Saw nothing. When I asked if he noticed anything strange, he just shrugged and said the lighting in the hospital made everyone look weird. By May, I'd documented 14 cases, all different causes of death: heart attacks, strokes, trauma, overdoses, but the same post-mortem movements occurring anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes after being pronounced. I tried everything to prove I wasn't imagining it. Bought a body camera with my own money, wore it during shifts claiming it was for training purposes, reviewed hours of footage, found nothing. The movements happened right in front of the camera, I saw them with my own eyes, but the recording showed only stillness. I even tried having Melissa meet me after a particularly difficult shift, where I'd seen a young man named Christopher Vance, motorcycle accident victim, breathing for 40 minutes after death. She held me while I explained everything, suggested maybe I was experiencing some kind of stress response, seeing what I wanted to see, signs of life where there were none. But why would I want to see that? Why would my mind create hope where there was definitively none? The breaking point came 3 nights ago, Saturday. We responded to a home where a 40-year-old woman named Diane Fowler had suffered a massive pulmonary embolism. Her teenage daughter had found her collapsed in the kitchen, called 911 while sobbing so hard, the dispatcher could barely understand her. We worked on Diane for an hour, longer than protocol suggested, because her daughter was watching from the doorway and I couldn't bear to stop. When we finally called it at 11:58 p.m., the daughter broke down completely. While Vanessa comforted her in the living room, I stayed with Diane's body waiting for the coroner. This time I was ready. I set up my phone, my body camera, even borrowed a GoPro from a friend and positioned it on the counter. At 12:19 a.m., Diane's eyes opened. Not fluttered, not twitched. Opened completely, staring directly at me. Her mouth moved like she was trying to speak, and her right hand lifted 3 inches off the gurney before settling back down. I was looking right at her, all 3 cameras running, my pulse racing so hard I thought I might need medical attention myself. When I checked the footage yesterday morning, all 3 cameras showed the same thing. Diane's body, perfectly still, gradually changing color as circulation ceased. The timestamps matched, the angles were different but complementary, and there was absolutely no movement, not even a shadow out of place. I sat in my kitchen replaying the videos over and over, comparing them to my memory, which remained crystal clear. Diane had looked at me, really looked at me, with awareness in her eyes that I've seen in hundreds of living patients. I called in sick for my next shift. Couldn't trust myself to work when I was either hallucinating or experiencing something that defied every medical principle I knew. Vanessa texted asking if I was okay, said Douglas was worried about me. Melissa came over with soup, found me surrounded by medical journals about post-mortem reflexes, Lazarus syndrome, anything that could explain what I was seeing. She suggested I talk to someone, maybe a therapist who specializes in healthcare workers. But here's what really disturbs me. I went back through the records yesterday. Every single one of those 14 patients, Arthur, Gloria, Frank, Dorothy, Christopher, Diane, all of them, were organ donors. Every single one. The hospital coordinator confirmed they all went through successful harvesting procedures, saved multiple lives with their donations. The organs were viable, healthy, functioning perfectly in their recipients. I know because I checked. I called the hospital under the pretense of following up for our quality improvement program. Now I'm sitting here at 2 a.m., writing this because I can't sleep, wondering if what I'm seeing isn't post-mortem reflexes at all. What if these people are still processing something, still present in some way we don't understand, during those crucial minutes after we call time of death? What if the reason only I can see it is something about me, some sensitivity or perception that makes me a witness to something the medical community isn't ready to acknowledge? I made a decision this morning. I'm taking a leave of absence from work, told Douglas it's for medical reasons, which isn't entirely a lie. But before I go, I need to document one more thing. I found out that Diane Fowler's organ retrieval is scheduled for tonight. They kept her on life support specifically for organ preservation, even though she was declared brain dead 3 days ago. I still have my hospital access badge, know the OR schedule, know which hallway leads to the operating room where they'll perform the retrieval. I'm not going to interfere. I would never do that. Those organs will save lives. But I need to be there. Need to see if she responds when they begin the procedure. Need to know if what I've been seeing connects to what happens in those operating rooms. The medical staff will assume I'm there for closure. It's not uncommon for first responders to follow up on difficult cases. They don't need to know about the small camera I'll have in my chest pocket, or that I've already accepted I might be recording nothing but my own breakdown. Whatever happens tonight, I'm done after this. If the footage shows nothing, I'll check myself into a psychiatric facility tomorrow, get the help everyone thinks I need. But if it shows something, anything that validates these past 6 months, then maybe I'm not crazy. Maybe there's something about the transition from life to death that we're missing. Something that only becomes visible under specific circumstances. I've spent my entire career trying to save lives, to pull people back from that edge. But maybe I've been given this perception for a different reason. Maybe someone needs to witness what happens in those moments after we stop trying, to ask whether our definition of death is as final as we believe it to be. I'll update this post tomorrow with whatever I find, assuming I'm still coherent enough to write. To anyone reading this who works in emergency medicine, have you ever seen something you couldn't explain? Something that made you question when death really occurs? Because I can't be the only one. There have to be others who've noticed, but stayed quiet, afraid of being labeled unstable. Tonight I'll know for sure. I'm a paramedic in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I've been doing this job for about 8 years now. Most calls become routine after a while. Cardiac arrests, overdoses, car accidents. You develop a thick skin and learn to compartmentalize. But what happened last October still keeps me up at night sometimes, wondering if there was something more I could have done, or if what we experienced even makes sense. I was working with my partner, Steve, a veteran with 23 years under his belt, and even he couldn't explain what we encountered at apartment 4B on Pinewood Court. We'd just finished a 12-hour shift, and were heading back to the station when dispatch called us about an unconscious person at that address. The caller was a neighbor, Mrs. Gladwell, an elderly woman who lived in 4C, right next door. She said she'd been hearing someone groaning through the wall, like they were in pain, and she was worried someone needed help. The building was one of those converted Victorian houses from the 1940s, split into 6 units with paper-thin walls and creaky wooden floors that announced every footstep. When we arrived, Mrs. Gladwell was waiting for us in the hallway, wearing a floral nightgown and those thick-soled slippers that elderly people favor. She was wringing her hands, clearly distressed, and kept saying she could hear someone calling out weakly, like they were struggling to breathe, Steve and I pressed our ears against the door of 4B, and sure enough, we could hear it too. This low, muffled sound that definitely seemed human. We knocked hard, announced ourselves as paramedics, but got no response except for those continued groans. The building manager wasn't answering his phone, and given what we were hearing, we made the decision to force entry. Steve had the tools, and within minutes we had the door open, ready to rush in and help whoever was in distress. The apartment was completely empty. Not just empty of people, I mean bare walls, no furniture, no personal belongings, nothing. The hardwood floors were covered in a thin layer of dust that showed our footprints as we walked through. The air had that stale, closed-up smell that places get when nobody's opened a window in weeks. Steve and I searched every room, the bedroom, bathroom, even checked the closets and behind the shower curtain. There was nobody there. The windows were all locked from the inside, painted shut actually, with old paint that had yellowed and cracked over the years. We stood there in the living room, both of us confused, when Mrs. Gladwell appeared in the doorway behind us. She looked around the empty apartment with wide eyes and said, "But I heard him. I know I heard him calling for help. Where's Mr. Hendrick?" That's when she told us the tenant's name, Walter Hendrick, a man in his 70s who'd lived there alone for the past 6 years. Steve radioed dispatch to check on Walter Hendrick while I talked to Mrs. Gladwell. She insisted she'd been hearing these sounds for the past 3 days, always around the same time in the evening, between 7 and 8 p.m. She described it as a man's voice, weak and raspy, sometimes just groaning, other times actually forming words like help or please. She'd knocked on his door multiple times but never got an answer, which is why she finally called 911. While she was explaining this, Steve got a call back from dispatch that made him pull me aside. They'd run the name Walter Hendrick through the system and found a report from 3 weeks earlier. EMS had been called to this exact address for a cardiac event. The patient, Walter Hendrick, had been pronounced dead on scene. The coroner's report showed he'd likely been dead for several days before anyone found him. He died alone in this apartment, probably calling for help that never came in time. The rational part of my brain kicked in immediately. I started thinking about explanations. Maybe the sounds were coming from another apartment, maybe pipes in the walls, or even rats. Old buildings make all kinds of noises, but Mrs. Gladwell was adamant about what she'd heard, and she wasn't some confused elderly person. She was sharp, articulate, and genuinely disturbed by what she'd been hearing. Steve suggested we check with other neighbors, so we knocked on doors. The young couple in 4A hadn't heard anything unusual, but they'd only been home during the day. The man in 4D, a night shift worker named Raymond, stopped us cold when he said, "Yeah, I've been hearing it too. Started about 3 days ago. Thought someone had their TV up too loud, but it sounded exactly like someone groaning in pain. Always seemed to come from Walter's place." He hadn't known Walter was dead. The building manager had kept it quiet to avoid scaring tenants. Raymond said the sounds usually lasted about 10 to 15 minutes, then just stopped abruptly. We decided to wait. If people were hearing these sounds between 7 and 8 p.m., and it was only 6:30 now, maybe we could figure out what was really happening. Steve and I sat in the empty apartment with Mrs. Gladwell, who refused to leave despite our suggestions that she wait in her own unit. She sat on the floor near the wall she shared with the apartment, her hand pressed against it like she was trying to feel for vibrations. At 7:14 p.m., it started. First, just a low moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then it got louder, more distinct, and I swear to God it sounded exactly like a person in distress. The sound was moving through the apartment, starting from the bedroom and traveling toward the living room where we sat. Steve jumped up and started checking everything, the radiators, the pipes behind the walls, even putting his ear to the electrical outlets. But the sound wasn't mechanical. It had the unmistakable quality of a human voice, complete with the little catches and variations that no machine or wind could replicate. Then came the words, faint but clear enough to understand. "Please, somebody help me." The voice was male, elderly, strained with effort. Mrs. Gladwell started crying, gripping my arm so hard it hurt. "That's him," she whispered. "That's Walter's voice. I've lived next to him for 6 years. We used to chat in the hallway about his grandchildren in Portland. That's his voice." Steve was pacing now, his face red with frustration. He'd been in this job long enough to see everything, but this was getting to him. The voice continued for maybe 5 more minutes, sometimes just breathing heavily, sometimes forming those same words, asking for help. We recorded it on Steve's phone, though the playback later sounded muffled and distorted, nothing like what we were hearing in person. At exactly 7:28 p.m., the sounds stopped completely, like someone had flipped a switch. The apartment returned to that heavy silence, just the 3 of us breathing, and the distant sound of traffic outside. Steve called our supervisor while I contacted the building manager, finally reaching him on his cell. His name was Carl Brenner, and he confirmed that Walter Hendrick had indeed died in the apartment 3 weeks ago. The body had been discovered after Mrs. Gladwell complained about a smell. Carl said Walter had been found in the bedroom, likely dead for 4 or 5 days based on decomposition. The saddest part? They found his phone on the floor next to him, battery dead, like he'd tried to call for help but couldn't reach it in his final moments. Carl had the apartment professionally cleaned and was planning to renovate before renting it again. When I asked him about any complaints of strange noises since then, he got quiet before admitting that the cleaning crew had refused to finish the job. They'd claimed they heard someone crying in the bedroom when nobody was there, and 2 of them simply walked out and never came back. He'd had to hire a different company to complete the cleaning. We stayed in that apartment until almost 9 p.m., but the sounds didn't return. Steve and I wrote up our report, carefully documenting everything we'd witnessed, though we both knew how it would look on paper. An empty apartment, no medical emergency, no patient to transport. Just a strange occurrence with no logical explanation. Before we left, I walked through the apartment one more time, and in the bedroom, I noticed something we'd missed earlier. On the hardwood floor, there were scratch marks near the corner, like someone had been dragging their fingers across the wood. Carl later confirmed those marks weren't there when they removed Walter's body. They'd appeared sometime after, and no amount of sanding seemed to remove them completely. Mrs. Gladwell told us that Walter had been a veteran, lived alone after his wife died of cancer 5 years ago. His children lived on the West Coast and rarely visited. She said he'd been getting frail in his final months, had fallen twice in the hallway, and she'd helped him back to his apartment both times. The calls kept coming. Over the next 2 weeks, we were dispatched to that same address 4 more times. Different neighbors calling, all reporting the same thing. Someone crying for help in 4B. Each time we'd arrive to find the apartment empty, but if we waited until that window between 7 and 8 p.m., we'd hear it. Other crews from our station experienced it too. My colleague Jennifer and her partner went out there on a Saturday night and came back visibly shaken. She said they'd heard not just the voice, but what sounded like someone dragging themselves across the floor, the sound of fingernails on wood. The police got involved after the 5th call, thinking maybe someone was playing an elaborate prank, hiding in the walls or using speakers. They brought in equipment, checked for hidden devices, even had a K9 unit search for anyone hiding. They found nothing. The detective in charge, a skeptical guy named Morrison, who'd been on the force for 15 years, stood in that apartment at 7:20 p.m. and heard the voice himself. His report simply stated, "Unexplained auditory phenomenon," and recommended the apartment be sealed pending further investigation. The breaking point came on a Monday evening, 11 days after our first call. This time, it wasn't a neighbor who called 911. It was Carl, the building manager. He'd gone into the apartment with a contractor to assess renovation costs when they both heard something that made them run out of the building. Carl was hyperventilating when we arrived, sitting on the curb with his head between his knees. He said the voice had been different this time, clearer, and it had said his name. "Carl, why didn't you check on me? Carl, I was calling for you." The contractor, a burly man named Anthony, who'd probably never run from anything in his life, was pale as a sheet. He corroborated Carl's story, said he'd heard it too, and he was done with the job. That's when Carl broke down and told us the truth. Walter had called him 3 times on the day he died. Carl saw the missed calls but didn't check his voicemail until days later, after the body was found. In the messages, Walter's voice was weak, saying he'd fallen, couldn't get up, needed help. The last message was just labored breathing. Carl had been living with the guilt, knowing that if he'd just answered his phone or checked those messages sooner, Walter might still be alive. After that Monday, everything stopped. No more sounds, no more voices, no more calls to 911. It was like whatever had been happening in that apartment had finally said what it needed to say. Carl had the unit sealed and eventually convinced the building owner to convert it into a storage space, rather than rent it out again. Mrs. Gladwell moved to her daughter's house in Virginia 2 months later, said she couldn't sleep properly knowing what had happened to Walter, knowing he'd died just a wall away from her while she was probably watching television, oblivious to his calls for help. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm on a call and someone's alone, scared, reaching out for help. There's probably a logical explanation, maybe some acoustic phenomenon, sound waves trapped in the building's structure, replaying under specific conditions. Maybe mass hysteria, though that doesn't explain what we all heard so clearly. Steve retired early last year, and when we had his farewell dinner, he pulled me aside and said that case still bothered him. Not because it was supernatural or impossible, but because it reminded him that sometimes people die calling for help that never comes. And maybe, somehow, some part of that desperation gets left behind. I don't know what we experienced in apartment 4B, but I know it was real. We all heard it. And then, once Carl's guilt was revealed, it stopped, like something had finally been acknowledged that needed to be heard. "7 months ago, I was finishing my second year as a paramedic in a mid-sized city in Pennsylvania. The job had its rough nights, sure, but nothing that really rattled me until that particular weekend in early April. I'd been partnered with a veteran EMT named Russell for about 6 months, and we'd developed a good rhythm together. He knew the city like the back of his hand, every shortcut, every hospital protocol, and he'd taught me more practical stuff than any training course ever could. That Friday started like any other night shift. We grabbed coffee from the gas station near the station house, checked our rig, and settled in for what we thought would be a typical 12-hour run. The dispatch radio crackled around 9 p.m. with our first call, a cardiac case that needed immediate transport to Riverside Medical Center, the main hospital downtown where we delivered probably 90% of our patients. The thing about Riverside Medical is that it's an old building built in sections over the decades since the 1940s. You had the original stone structure, then the glass tower they added in the 70s, and various wings and additions that made the whole place a maze if you didn't know your way around. Russell and I had just loaded our patient, an elderly man with chest pains who was stable but needed monitoring, when dispatch came through with specific instructions that made Russell pause. They told us to deliver to the cardiac unit on the 7th floor, East Wing. Now, I'd been to Riverside hundreds of times by then, and something about that instruction seemed weird. The cardiac unit I knew was on the 4th floor of the main building. Russell grabbed the radio and asked dispatch to confirm, and they repeated it clear as day. 7th floor, East Wing, they'd been notified to expect us. The patient's vitals were stable, so we didn't argue. Just figured maybe they'd moved things around or opened a new specialized unit we hadn't heard about yet. When we pulled into the ambulance bay, everything seemed normal at first. The security guard at the entrance, Eddie, who always had a joke ready for us, just waved us through without his usual banter. The automatic doors slid open, and we wheeled our patient through the familiar fluorescent-lit corridors toward the elevator bank. Russell hit the call button while I kept monitoring the old man's oxygen levels and EKG readings. The elevator arrived quickly, one of the newer ones they'd installed a few years back, and we rolled inside. Russell pressed 7, and I watched the numbers climb. 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7 lit up with a soft ding. What happened next is burned into my memory because it was so completely wrong. The doors slid open smoothly, but instead of the bright hospital corridor we expected, we were facing a wall of darkness. Not dim lighting or a powered down section. I mean absolute pitch black, like staring into a cave. The temperature dropped instantly, maybe 15 or 20 degrees, and there was this smell. Stale and medical but old, like bandages that had been sitting in a closet for decades. Russell immediately hit the door close button, but they stayed open for those eternal 30 seconds that elevator doors do. I aimed my pen light into the darkness and caught glimpses of what looked like an abandoned corridor. Dust particles floating in the beam, old gurneys pushed against walls, and those ancient IV stands from the 80s with the metal hooks. The walls had that old mint green paint that hospitals used decades ago, peeling and water-stained in places. Our patient started getting agitated, his heart rate spiking on the monitor, asking what was happening, where we were taking him. Russell was already on his radio, trying to reach dispatch, but all we got was static, which never happened inside Riverside. The elevator doors finally started closing, and Russell quickly pressed 4, taking us back down to the cardiac unit we actually knew. Neither of us said anything for a moment, just exchanged this look that said we'd both seen the same impossible thing. The patient's vitals were climbing, so we focused on keeping him calm, telling him we just had a little confusion with the floors. Nothing to worry about. We delivered the patient to the actual cardiac unit on the 4th floor without any further issues. The charge nurse, Bethany, took him right away, and while she was getting him settled, Russell pulled me aside and asked if I wanted to report what just happened. But report what exactly? That an elevator took us to what looked like an abandoned floor. We both knew how that would sound. Instead, Russell suggested we talk to Eddie on our way out, maybe ask casually if there'd been any construction or changes to the 7th floor. Eddie just looked at us funny when we brought it up, said the East Wing only went up to 6 floors. Always had since he'd been working there for 15 years. The 7th floor of the main building was administrative offices, he said. No patient areas at all. Russell and I didn't push it, just headed back to our rig, but I could tell we were both processing what we'd experienced. The rest of that shift was quiet, normal calls, normal deliveries, but that 7th floor thing sat between us like a third passenger we couldn't acknowledge. The next night, Saturday, we were back on shift, and around 11 p.m., we got another call that made my chest tighten. Dispatch directed us to transport a stroke patient to Riverside Medical, 7th floor East Wing Neurology Unit. Russell and I locked eyes across the rig. He picked up the radio real careful and asked dispatch to repeat the destination. Same thing, 7th floor, East Wing, neurology had a bed ready and waiting. This time, Russell pushed back, told dispatch that the East Wing only had 6 floors. Could they please verify? There was a pause, maybe 10 seconds of dead air. Then dispatch came back sounding confused, saying they were just reading what was in the system, but they'd double-check with the hospital. A minute later, they corrected, patient should go to the 6th floor neurology unit. We delivered that patient without incident, but when we checked with the 6th floor nurses, none of them had heard anything about a 7th floor unit. One older nurse must have been there for 30 years, gave us this strange look when we mentioned it and just shook her head, walking away without saying anything. Sunday night was when things got genuinely disturbing. We'd had a busy evening, 3 calls back to back, and around 2 a.m. we were transporting a young woman who'd been in a car accident, conscious but with potential internal injuries that needed immediate evaluation. Dispatch came through crystal clear, Riverside Medical, 7th floor East Wing Trauma Unit. By now, Russell and I had developed a routine. He'd immediately radio back for clarification, while I documented everything in my notebook. Times, exact words, everything. But this time, dispatch insisted. They said they'd confirmed directly with Riverside the trauma team was waiting on 7 East. The woman we were transporting was getting scared, picking up on our hesitation. So Russell made the call to just head to Riverside and take her to the regular ER. But when we arrived and rolled into the elevator, something different happened. I pressed the lobby button, planning to check with information first, but the elevator started moving on its own. The display showed we were going up, 1, 2, 3, and it wouldn't respond to any buttons we pressed. At the 7th floor, the doors opened to that same darkness, but this time we heard something that made my whole body go rigid. From somewhere deep in that black corridor came the sound of monitors beeping, that steady rhythm of heart monitors and ventilators, dozens of them, all slightly out of sync, creating this horrible cacophony. And underneath that, barely audible, was a voice on an intercom calling out room numbers and doctor names I'd never heard before. Our patient started crying, begging us not to take her in there, and honestly, I was ready to carry her down the stairs if I had to. Russell jammed his hand between the closing doors to keep them open, while frantically hitting the emergency button. The beeping got louder, and I swear the air coming from that corridor was even colder than before, with this smell like old rubber and something else, something organic and wrong. The elevator suddenly lurched, the doors forced themselves closed despite Russell's attempts, and we descended straight to the ER level without stopping. Security was there when the doors opened, 2 guards who said they'd gotten an alert about a stuck elevator, but the elevator had only been stopped for maybe 30 seconds according to their systems. After we got that patient safely to the ER and finished our shift, Russell did something I didn't expect. He went to the hospital's administrative office that morning and asked to see old building records. He had a cousin who worked in facilities management, and she let us look through some archived blueprints and documents during her break. What we found made everything infinitely worse. There had been a 7th floor in the East Wing, built in 1979 as a state-of-the-art ICU with the latest equipment for critical care. All the paperwork was there: construction permits, equipment purchases, staff assignments. Then we found a newspaper clipping from August 1987 that Russell's cousin had tucked into the files. During a summer storm, the hospital's backup generators had failed, and the 7th floor lost power for 14 hours. 43 patients died that night, all of them on ventilators or life support that failed when the power went out. The families sued, there was a massive investigation, and ultimately the hospital board decided to seal off the entire floor rather than renovate it. They removed it from the elevator system, blocked the stairwell access, and essentially erased it from the building's official layout. But here's what really disturbed us. Russell's cousin pulled up the current dispatch system on her computer, and there it was in the drop-down menu for Riverside Medical, 7th floor East Wing, with options for different units. She tried to delete it, said it must be some old data that never got purged, but the system wouldn't let her. Every time she removed it, it would reappear within seconds. She even called IT while we were standing there, and they remoted into her computer, tried to trace where this phantom floor data was coming from. The IT tech got really quiet after a few minutes and said he'd have to escalate this, that the entries were being generated by user accounts that had been deactivated for decades. The original dispatch operators from the 1980s, whose login credentials somehow were still creating automated entries in the modern system. Russell asked how that was possible, and the tech just said sometimes old hospital systems had redundancies and backups that nobody remembered, ghost data that lived in servers that hadn't been properly decommissioned. That evening was my last shift at Riverside. We'd gotten through most of the night without any calls to the hospital, when around 4 a.m., dispatch sent us for an elderly man with breathing difficulties. The destination came through before we even reached the patient. Riverside Medical, 7th floor East Wing, respiratory unit. Russell and I didn't even discuss it this time. We picked up the patient, stabilized him, and drove straight to County Medical 15 minutes further away, telling dispatch we'd had to divert due to traffic. But during that drive, something happened that still makes me sick to think about. The patient, who'd been barely conscious when we loaded him, suddenly grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. His eyes were wide and unfocused, and he kept repeating a room number, 7E42, 7E42, said his wife was waiting for him there, that he needed to get to 7E42. Russell looked up that room number later in those old hospital records. Room 7E42 had been occupied by a woman named Helen Garrett who died in the 1987 power failure. Our patient's last name was Garrett. We delivered him to County Medical, but he passed away 3 hours later. The attending physician said it was expected given his age and condition, but the way he'd been so insistent about that room number, it felt like something had been calling him to a place that didn't exist anymore, at least not in any way we understand. I transferred to a different company the next week, one that doesn't service Riverside Medical. Russell stayed on for another month before taking early retirement, something he'd been planning anyway, he said, though I knew better. Before I left, we filed a formal report about the elevator and dispatch system issues, recommended a full IT audit and safety review. The hospital's response was that they'd found no technical irregularities but would update their systems as a precaution. But here's the thing. I still keep in touch with other paramedics in the area, and every few weeks someone mentions getting those 7th floor calls. They always get corrected now. Dispatchers immediately revise them to the 6th floor of the main building. But those initial calls keep coming through. Whatever's happening with that floor, whether it's old computer systems, electromagnetic interference from abandoned equipment, or something else entirely, it's still active. The hospital announced plans last month to demolish the entire East Wing and rebuild it, but construction keeps getting delayed. The latest excuse was that they found asbestos, but a contractor friend told me the real reason. They can't figure out how to safely access the 7th floor to prep it for demolition. Every time workers try to break through the sealed stairwells, their equipment fails, batteries drain, and 3 workers have reportedly quit after hearing those monitor alarms echoing through the walls. "23 years as a paramedic in Austin, Texas, and I thought I'd seen everything. You get jaded after a while. Overdoses, car wrecks, domestic violence calls that turn ugly. My partner Brett and I worked the night shift, which meant we got the weird stuff, the drunk calls, the lonely elderly folks who just needed someone to talk to. It was a Wednesday in July 2023, around 2 a.m., when dispatch crackled through our radio about a cardiac arrest at 4782 Birchwood Lane. Standard procedure, lights and sirens, Brett navigating while I checked our equipment. The address seemed familiar, but at that hour, everything blurs together. We'd been pulling 12-hour shifts all week, and the exhaustion made everything feel like déjà vu. The house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, completely dark except for our ambulance lights painting red and blue across its peeling white siding. No porch light, no movement behind the windows, no car in the cracked driveway that had grass growing through the concrete like green veins. Brett grabbed the jump bag while I wheeled out the gurney, both of us moving fast, but something felt wrong about the silence. Usually someone meets you at the door, a panicked spouse, a neighbor who heard commotion, somebody. But there was nothing, just our equipment rattling and the distant hum of the highway 2 blocks over. I pounded on the front door hard enough to wake the whole street, announced ourselves as EMS, waited for any response. The door was locked, no answer, and when Brett shined his flashlight through the front window, we could see an empty living room with a thick layer of dust on the floor, undisturbed like fresh snow. We circled the house, checking every window, every door, looking for any sign of life or forced entry. The backyard was overgrown, waist-high weeds that hadn't been touched in months, maybe years. An old swing set stood rusted in the corner, one swing hanging by a single chain like a broken arm. Brett called dispatch to confirm the address while I kept searching, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. They confirmed it. 4782 Birchwood Lane. Caller reported chest pains, difficulty breathing, said they were alone and couldn't get to the door. The dispatcher, Nancy, sounded confused too. She said the caller's voice was clear, not muffled or distant, and they'd given this exact address twice when asked to confirm. But standing there in that abandoned backyard, listening to crickets and looking at windows covered in grime, we both knew nobody had called from this house. The next-door neighbor's lights flicked on, and an elderly man in a bathrobe shuffled onto his porch, squinting at us through thick glasses. He told us nobody had lived in that house for at least 3 years, not since the Dawson family moved to Michigan. The house was supposed to be on the market, but the realtor had trouble selling it, something about foundation issues and outdated electrical. He seemed irritated that we'd woken him up, kept asking if we were sure we had the right address. Brett showed him the call information on his tablet, and the old man just shrugged, said maybe someone was playing pranks, kids breaking in to make false calls. But there were no broken windows, no jimmied locks, No footprints in the dust when we looked through the windows again. We spent another 15 minutes searching before dispatch called us away to a real emergency, a motorcycle accident on the interstate. 2 nights later, same thing. This time it was around 4 a.m., and dispatch sounded apologetic when they called us. Same address, same reported symptoms, chest pains, trouble breathing, elderly male caller who said he couldn't make it to the door. Nancy was on dispatch again, and she swore the call was legitimate. Came through the 911 system just like any other call. The caller ID showed the landline number registered to 4782 Birchwood Lane. Brett and I exchanged looks when we heard the address. We'd already discussed the weird call with our supervisor, who'd written it off as a technical glitch, maybe crossed wires or someone spoofing the phone system. But here we were again, pulling up to that same dark house with its overgrown lawn and empty driveway. This time we brought the police with us. Officer Daniels and his partner arrived right after we did, and together we went through the same routine, knocking, announcing ourselves, circling the property with our flashlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Daniels managed to contact the property owner, some investment company based in Houston, that bought it from the bank after foreclosure. They confirmed the house was vacant, had been empty since they acquired it 18 months ago. The electricity had been shut off for non-payment before that, and the phone service was supposedly disconnected at the same time. Yet when Nancy played back the 911 recording for us later, we could all hear it clear as day. An elderly man's voice, strained but articulate, giving the address and describing classic heart attack symptoms. The voice sounded local, had that distinctive Central Texas drawl, not like a recording or computer generation. He even answered Nancy's follow-up questions appropriately, said he was 78 years old, lived alone, had a history of heart problems. When she asked him to stay on the line, he said he would. But then the line went silent, though the connection stayed open for another 3 minutes before cutting off. The calls kept coming, not every night, but often enough that dispatch started documenting everything, building a case file. Sometimes it was twice a week, sometimes we'd go 10 days without one, then get 3 calls in 2 nights. Always between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m., always the same elderly male voice, always reporting cardiac symptoms. The details would vary slightly. Sometimes he'd mention chest pressure, other times radiating pain in his left arm, occasionally shortness of breath and dizziness. But the voice was consistent, and he always gave the same age, same address. Always said he lived alone. The phone company got involved after the 5th call, sent technicians out during daylight hours. They confirmed what we already knew: no active service, lines physically disconnected at the pole, the interior phone jacks dead when they tested them. They even checked for illegal connections, thinking maybe someone had tapped into the line somehow, but found nothing. The whole system was as dead as the house itself. Brett started recording everything on his personal phone, documenting each call-out. He became obsessed with finding an explanation, spent his off hours researching phone phreaking, VoIP spoofing, any technical way someone could fake these calls. But every expert he talked to said the same thing. If the physical line was disconnected at the pole, there was no way a call could originate from that number through the traditional 911 system. The police set up surveillance one night, had a unit parked across the street for a full week. Nothing. No movement, no lights, no sign of anyone entering or leaving the property. But on night 6 of their surveillance, the call came through again. The officer watched the house the entire time, swore on his badge that nobody was inside. No lights came on. Nothing moved. Yet Nancy had another recording of that same elderly voice, gasping this time, saying his chest felt like an elephant was sitting on it, begging for help. I started digging into the history of the house on my own time, spending hours at the county records office and online. The Dawson family, who'd lived there last, were a young couple with 2 kids, moved for a job opportunity. Nothing unusual there. Before them, the house had changed hands several times over the years, typical for the neighborhood. But then I found something that made me pause. In August 2016, a man named Leonard Hutchins had owned the property. 78 years old, Lived alone after his wife died. History of cardiac problems. He died in the house. A massive heart attack, the coroner's report said. A neighbor found him 3 days later after newspapers piled up on his driveway. The report noted he'd been found near the phone in the hallway, receiver off the hook. The 911 logs from that night showed no call from his address. He'd died trying to reach the phone, probably grabbed it as he went down but never managed to dial. The calls suddenly stopped after we found this information. Not gradually, not tapering off. They just stopped. The last one came on a Monday morning in August, exactly 7 years to the day after Leonard Hutchins died. I was there for that final call, heard Nancy's side of the conversation, watched her face go pale as she listened. She said this call was different. The voice was the same, but calmer. No panic or pain in it. He simply said, "Thank you for coming," and hung up. We still responded, had to follow protocol, but I knew we wouldn't find anything. The house stood empty as always, dust undisturbed, no sign anyone had been inside for years. The phone company came back one more time, removed the physical line from the pole entirely, took out all the equipment. The investment company eventually sold the property, and a young family renovated it completely, gutted it down to the studs, and rebuilt. I drive past that house sometimes when I'm working that side of town. The new family has painted it yellow with white trim, planted a garden, installed a modern doorbell system with a camera. Kids' toys scatter the front yard, and warm light spills from the windows at night. They seem happy, unaware of what happened before they moved in. I've never told them about the calls, figured there was no point in disturbing their peace. Brett transferred to day shift 6 months after the calls stopped, said he needed a change, but I know it bothered him that we never found a logical explanation. Nancy still works dispatch, and we've never talked about it directly. But sometimes when a cardiac call comes in during those early morning hours, I hear a slight hesitation in her voice when she reads the address, like she's checking twice to make sure it's real. The department's official report lists it as a technical anomaly, possibly someone using sophisticated equipment to spoof calls, case closed due to cessation of activity. But I know what I heard in those recordings, and I've worked enough cardiac arrests to recognize genuine distress in someone's voice. Whatever explanation people want to accept, crossed wires, electromagnetic interference, someone's elaborate prank, the fact remains that for several months, someone or something made those calls from a disconnected phone in an empty house. I don't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, never have. But I can't explain what happened at 4782 Birchwood Lane. All I know is that somewhere in those early morning hours, someone was calling for help, and we kept showing up even when there was nobody there to save. Maybe that's all that mattered in the end. That someone answered, that someone came, even 7 years too late. Back when I was working full-time as a paramedic in the downtown district, my life revolved around 12-hour shifts, endless coffee, and the constant ring of dispatch alerts. I lived in a small apartment not far from the station, barely saw my neighbors, and spent most of my free time either catching up on sleep or grabbing late-night takeout. The city itself always felt restless, like it never really went quiet, even at 3 a.m. That year, I was partnered with Daniel, a guy with a dry sense of humor and a talent for staying calm no matter how chaotic the call got. We had handled just about everything together: overdoses in alleys, traffic accidents on jam-packed streets, even the occasional warehouse fire evacuation. But one call stands out in my memory, and it still makes me uneasy when I think back on it. The first time we were dispatched to that office building, the call came in as a possible cardiac arrest inside one of the elevators. It was late afternoon, a weekday, and the streets outside the building were buzzing with people heading home. Security met us at the front entrance, pale and sweating, pointing us straight to the elevator bank. He said a woman had called 911 screaming that her coworker collapsed inside the elevator between the 9th and 10th floor. When the door slid open in front of us, the cab was completely empty. No one was inside. Not a briefcase, Not a single dropped item, just the faint hum of the overhead light. We exchanged a look, half expecting someone to be slumped in the corner and somehow invisible at first glance, but the space was spotless. We chalked it up to a prank call or maybe a misunderstanding, but within a week we were sent back. This time the report said 2 people had fainted in the elevator, again between the 9th and 10th floors. Same routine. We rushed up with the stretcher, pried the doors open, and once again, nothing. The stainless steel walls reflected our confused faces, and the faint smell of cleaning supplies hung in the air like the janitors had just been through. No signs of struggle, no dropped purses or jackets, just silence. Daniel muttered that maybe kids had found a way to mess with the emergency call system, but I could see his unease. Dispatch doesn't usually get fooled twice in the same spot. The 3rd call was different. By then, we were already rolling our eyes when the building's address came across the radio. But this time, the report mentioned an older man clutching his chest inside the elevator. We moved fast, adrenaline kicking in, only to arrive and find the doors already pried open by security. Once again, the cab was vacant. The guard on duty swore he had watched the elevator stall on the security feed with someone inside, and then nothing. He replayed the footage for us later, but the screen went grainy right as the figure inside leaned against the wall. When the picture cleared, the elevator was empty. That was the night I started asking questions about the building. Later that week, I cornered one of the maintenance guys in the lobby, a stocky man named Leonard, who smelled constantly of machine oil. When I asked about the elevator, he gave me this strange look and said flat out, "That thing's been shut down for years. We don't even have power running to it." At first, I thought he was joking, but the way his hand stayed shoved deep in his coveralls told me he wasn't. He explained that years earlier, a man had suffered a fatal cardiac event inside that same elevator. The place was busy, and somehow no one noticed the cab had stalled. By the time anyone found him, hours had passed. After that, the building owners ordered the elevator locked down permanently. Hearing that sent a chill through me, because it didn't match what we'd been responding to. If the elevator was shut down, then where were the calls coming from? Leonard swore up and down that the emergency line inside had been disconnected, and he even showed me the panel in the basement with wires clipped neatly. The building had 4 other working elevators, all with their call systems intact, so there was no reason for false signals to come from the sealed one. Still, dispatch logs clearly showed multiple distress calls originating from that shaft. It didn't add up, and the longer I thought about it, the less I could dismiss it as a prank. A few nights later, we got another call, same building, same story. I remember riding the working elevator up with Daniel, both of us unusually quiet, listening to the soft whine of the cables overhead. When the doors opened on the 10th floor, the lights in the hallway flickered, just once, like someone had flipped a switch too fast. Security was waiting for us again, wide-eyed, pointing to the sealed elevator as if expecting us to pry it open. We all stood there, listening. Faintly, from inside the locked cab, came the sound of muffled coughing followed by a weak thump, like someone collapsing against the wall. Daniel banged on the doors, shouting for whoever was inside to hang on, but his voice just echoed through the shaft. The guard swore he heard it too, and even radioed to the control room to check the cameras. They reported the same thing. The elevator had stalled between floors and the feed showed a man slumped in the corner. Yet when we forced the doors open with the emergency key, the cab was spotless. No man, no sign of struggle, just the faint metallic tang in the air, almost like old blood. I don't scare easily on the job, but that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were answering calls that should never have existed. Word spread among the crew that Daniel and I kept getting the phantom elevator calls. Some joked about it, others avoided talking about it altogether. Dispatch eventually flagged the address so that any call from that building would get routed straight to our unit, almost like they wanted consistency in who dealt with it. That night, we got another ping. Possible fainting inside the elevator, same floor range. By then, the whole thing had taken on this strange ritual. Security guiding us to the locked doors, the faint noise inside, and the empty cab waiting. But this time, when we arrived, the building manager was there too, sweating through his tie and visibly shaken. He begged us not to go up, insisting there was no way the call was real. We went anyway. The manager trailed behind us, muttering about liability and bad publicity. The elevator doors on the 9th floor were closed tight, but from inside we all heard it. A low, desperate moan followed by the faint click of the emergency phone being lifted. Daniel and I exchanged a look, and before either of us said a word, the manager shoved an old brass key into my hand. He admitted it was the master key for the sealed elevator, something he claimed hadn't been used in over a decade. I slid it into the slot, turned it, and the doors slowly creaked apart. The cab was pitch dark. We aimed our flashlights inside, and that's when I saw it, clear as day for maybe 3 seconds. A man in a crumpled gray suit leaned against the back wall, his mouth open as if trying to breathe, one hand clutching his chest. His skin looked drained, waxy, and his eyes locked onto mine like he was begging for help. Daniel shouted, "Sir!" and stepped forward, but in the blink of an eye, the cab was empty again. Just 4 blank walls and the buzzing of our flashlights against the steel. The manager gasped and backed away, insisting we close it back up. He looked like he might faint himself. After that night, the building owners ordered the entire elevator bank sealed behind steel panels. Dispatch stopped getting calls from that address, almost like whatever was reaching out had finally been cut off. Daniel and I never got another phantom call again, but I'll never forget that man's eyes staring right at me in the beam of my flashlight. People sometimes ask if I believe in ghosts, and I usually laugh it off. But when I pass that office tower, I can't help but wonder if someone is still waiting inside that locked elevator, reaching for a phone that isn't even connected anymore.